Right. Hi, everyone. Happy Tuesday afternoon or morning, depending on where you're dialing in from. I know we've just hit 4 o'clock here and I'm based in Spain. So I'm just going to run through a little bit of housekeeping while we wait for people to join kind of in this first couple of minutes in case anyone's running late. So anyone not familiar with this kind of webinar platform, you'll see there is an option in the bottom right corner. Hopefully it's the same interface for you to ask any questions. So please, throughout the session, feel free to ask questions. Myself and John will answer these sort of in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the session. And we're hoping to run the session for 45 minutes. So we'll be here until 1:45. Maybe a quick, I can already see a message in the chat. Hi, Eleanor. So she's on our team here at Mitiga. So yeah, happy to have her joining. So maybe welcome. Today we're going to be discussing the sustainability agenda and how it can survive in a changing climate. Now, a quick introduction from me, and then I'll hand over to the wonderful John. So I'm with Mitiga Solutions. For anyone not familiar, Mitiga Solutions provides climate intelligence, specifically looking at climate-related physical risk. So looking at the exposure businesses and assets are exposed to kind of due to climate change and what's coming into the future. My role is I'm a policy lead. My background is in sustainability reporting, much to John's dismay. But my role here at Mitiga is I help kind of integrate sustainability reporting and kind of climate intelligence so that we can bring products and solutions to our customers that help them go beyond compliance, meeting their reporting needs. Now, I'm going to hand over to John, sometimes known as the godfather of sustainability. Please, John, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, thanks, Jessica. And I see in the chat channel, I'm instructed to say something nice. And every time I'm instructed to do something, I sort of tend to go off at a tangent or a different direction. But so, as you said, I'm John Elkington. I've been 50 years professionally in the sustainability space. You mentioned sustainability reporting. I mean, I spent 35, 40 years trying to get companies to report, to disclose, to be more transparent, and therefore hopefully more accountable. My only concern at the moment, and you know it, is that what we see is a huge pressure on companies to report. So the supply side being cracked, but actually the demand side's not yet in place properly. So people are not feeding on that data in the way that they ought to be doing, at least in my mind, to steer their sustainability strategies, whether that's at sectoral, economy, or regional level. So I'm all for reporting. I just think it has to be done in the right way. Back to you.
Thank you, John. And I think that helps kind of frame the first question that I kind of want to bring to you. So we do see kind of a shift in the economy, and regulation is very much supporting this sustainability movement and driving efforts. Albeit there is a lot happening that shows some of this effort might be kind of getting stripped back if we look at what's happening at Omnibus, but maybe we touch on that later. I still see it as a positive trajectory. But a lot of businesses, I think, are treating sustainability very much as a compliance exercise rather than a strategic shift, or I think you often use the term systemic change. So in a future that's very much defined by climate and climate change, do you think that businesses following this kind of reactive approach to sustainability will be able to survive, or do you actually think a bit more proactivity is needed?
Well, it depends what their sector is and what their geography is, but the simple answer is no. I don't think they'll be able to survive and flourish. And just your point on regulation, I think regulation is fundamentally important. I think that without it, we don't have the sort of coherent strategic responses that we will need. But at the same time, and exactly as you already referenced, Jessica, what we see is a compliance mindset coming back into this space. And when I talk to chief sustainability officers, one of the things I'm routinely now hearing is that I have no time to do anything else but crank the handle on the reporting machinery, which is alarming, because actually we need these people to be thinking very different thoughts and spending time on bringing their top team colleagues along with them. So reporting really, really helpful, but it's a necessary, not a sufficient condition for what we need to see happen next.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think we can go into a little bit later that feeling that sustainability teams are faced with of being very stretched and kind of struggling to balance it all. If we maybe look a little bit at the history of sustainability reporting, I mean, I see it shifting now, but it has historically been very focused on decarbonisation. Net zero targets has been a hot topic, and I think resilience has maybe taken a little bit of a backseat to date. Do you think that we've been over-prioritising decarbonisation?
Well, if you look at the climate agenda and you look at the climate science behind it, which I've tried to do over quite a number of decades now, we are nowhere near addressing the nature and the scale of the emergency that is coming at us. So I think the regulation is not fit for purpose. I think the reporting that we're doing is not fit for purpose. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing it, but we should be evolving all of these things as we do them. And then the question is whether decarbonisation has swamped out everything else. Well, we're simple-minded creatures very often, and if we're told to get rid of carbon, we'll obsess about that and not think about the wider picture. So in that sense, I think it has been, for some people, a distraction. It's partly because carbon is easy and greenhouse gases are relatively easy to put on a spreadsheet. If you start to think about nature and biodiversity, ecosystems, these sorts of things, much harder to put in a legitimate and useful way into a spreadsheet. But that's now where we have to go. So it's not either or. I think we've really got to get on top of the decarbonisation imperative and trajectories, but at the same time, we've got to open this out and realize that this is a systemic crisis. It's not simply about a set of gases or elements or molecules. It's about what we're doing to the biosphere. And unless and until we really get our brains around that and start to address that challenge, I think we're setting ourselves up to fail.
I'm hearing you put decarbonisation and easy in the same sentence, and I know, having looked at the attendees, we have a lot of sustainability consultants here, and I know it's not always easy for them, but I do agree it's not as ambiguous, I think, as some of these newer concepts that are emerging, like, say, biodiversity and so on. Yeah, very much so. Question on then more looking at reporting now and into the future. If we look at kind of the emerging regulations and standards that are coming out, we've got CSRD, we have the ISSB also leading work there, and they're starting to look at a lot more than just decarbonisation and starting to bring, I think, other topics to the table. Do you think that these standards are going to be really supportive in helping resilience and as an example, be a kind of a key discussion topic, or do you think it's carrying on to enforce that box ticking exercise?
I don't know. It would be very easy to pontificate and suggest that I have a panoptic vision of everything that's going on in the world. And the faster things go on the regulatory front, the less anyone can have a proper sense of what's being done and how it's working out and all the rest of it. I think so much. It also depends where in the world you're choosing to focus. So in the States, for example, it's a screaming nightmare at the moment. In Europe, we're going to have to focus on competition, not just on doing what would be right on decarbonisation or broader sustainability. So I've said for a while now, I think that the impact of Trump 2.0 is going to be growing pressure on the European Commission to scale back on some of the things that it's put in place in regulatory fashion. I think that's necessary because I think a lot of these different approaches, and you rattle through some of the acronyms, they've been put together with the right intent. But when you look at practically how they play through and the extent to which they genuinely create a Europe that is, and a European economy that is more resilient in the context of what's going on in the wider world, I have to say I don't think that's the case. I think that they're actually making things more bureaucratic. Regulation always does that. It drives us towards a compliance mindset. We've already discussed that. The question is, how do we get entrepreneurs and innovators and investors across the European space, if we choose that region for the moment, to focus more on evolution, not on compliance, not on efficiency, not on being a good citizen, but what our economies, what our sectors of industry, what our companies and their supply chains need to do now in order to evolve so that they're fit for purpose in the coming decades. And I think that conversation, discussion, to me is still at a relatively early stage in most C-suites and boardrooms in Europe. At the moment, it's going strongly backwards in the United States. But it's funny, I do think the US will come back. I think Trump will be quite surprised at some of the reactions that come up over the next 12 to 18 months. But anyway, cross fingers and we'll see what happens.
I think I did hear you actually in a different interview talk about how in order to work in this space, as in someone like yourself or I, we all need to have some level of optimism in order to do the job that we're doing today. When you speak to evolution, do you think that evolution
if we're going in a direction where that out, we are going to be effective. We cannot simply be Old Testament prophets and constantly rail about how ghastly things are going to be. We have to project a degree of hope and a degree of optimism. Otherwise, people, it's human nature. We switch off, leave it to somebody else.
I think we might have had a mini Wi-Fi cut on either on my side or your side, but I think we're both back now. But I did hear that of your point. But you were speaking before about an evolution that's needed. How much of that is industry specific, or do you think there's some kind of more general evolution that is more agnostic across industry?
Well, it's a great question, and I think the answer is complicated because the system that we're trying to change is complicated. I don't think business can do this on its own. One of the things I've been doing in recent times is spending a little bit more time focusing not just on individual companies and the brands, business models, boards, supply chains that they use to do what they do, but trying to open out the focus and say, okay, we spent 50 years now, some of us, trying to get companies to behave, but it's very clear, and we're seeing the pullback on publicly declared commitments around decarbonization, but a bunch of other things, particularly diversity, equity, and inclusion. If companies are going to be quite volatile, they'll commit to things as long as the wind is in, following them or pushing them along. But then as soon as the wind changes, they'll vacillate and go somewhere else. Then we have to make sure that markets force business to do the right thing as the default setting. And so I've been spending more time on that. But then to your question, I think markets are complex because they aren't simply to do with technology and business models and what particular businesses or industry sectors do. They're also about what governments want and how they choose to put that into force. They're what customers, consumers want, they're what investors want. And I think what we've got to do increasingly is operate across a very, very complex landscape of multiple different actors. And I think the whole sort of almost Trump emergency is a wake-up call to the sustainability industry, if I can call it that, to get our act together such that in 12 to 18 months, when the world wakes up, Trump's not going to work out terribly well. So what are the alternatives? We've got to have a much clearer and a much more seductive, in a way, proposition on that front.
Now, if we look at that, say, sustainability industry or those sustainability professionals, I think a common pain point that we've already acknowledged and is very prevalent around many of our customers is obviously how stretched these teams are, both within consultancies, but also direct sustainability teams within organizations. Do you have any advice for kind of leaders in these space that are balancing all of these competing demands?
Well, the one thing is not to be completely obsessed with what's going on at Washington, D.C. at the moment, but to pay sufficient attention not to be surprised, and it's impossible not to be surprised on a daily basis of what's coming out of that. But the World Economic Forum last year and again this year, when it asked its 3,000 whatever participants to sort of rank the challenges and opportunities to some degree for the next sort of 2 to 3 and 10 years, it was fascinating, as many of you members of your audience will know, to see that 5 of the top 10 were environmental. A number of them were to do with things like misinformation and disinformation. That's no surprise. Cybersecurity and so on. When we've got Chinese vessels dragging their anchors through the Baltic to cut digital cables, we begin to see the nature of what's coming at us. So I think I'm oddly, and I may be delusional, but I'm oddly more energized than I have been for 10 to 15 years, because I suddenly think, rather than this simply being a set of nice conversations with like-minded people in business and financial houses and so on, this is suddenly becoming a real crisis where we've got to step up and as I said earlier on, come together and provide a coherent or a more coherent set of propositions for the future, exactly as the right-wing actors have done over the last 40 to 50 years. We're going to have to catch up in relatively short order.
Now, on this topic and kind of the broadness of it, I want to touch a little bit on the role of technology, because obviously we are working in a kind of climate tech space, and there's a lot of advancements happening in climate analytics and kind of AI-driven tools. And how I kind of want to get your perspective on how you think technology will kind of hold the hand of this sustainability agenda and being able to kind of tackle it a lot more efficiently.
Well, I love the idea of a humanoid robot holding the hand of the sustainability industry as we gaily move into a brighter future. It brings to mind shoe advertisements for children in the 1960s. It's a long time ago. But anyway, I think technology is essential. I don't think we can do this without technology. And one of the obsessions of the moment is artificial intelligence. I don't think we can do this without AI. But any notion that the AI industry has sustainability as the forefront of its mind the whole time, I think would itself be delusional. Having said which, 7 or 8 years ago, I mean, I've always been fascinated by science and technology, and I spent a lot of time visiting people in those worlds in different parts of the world. And I became much more interested in AI. I started to sort of get in touch with people like DeepMind in London, HP I was working with at the time, and talked to some of their AI people. And the thing that really, really, really struck me at that time was how these were very often much younger people than I am. It's not hard to be younger than I am. But their brains were completely locked on the sorts of issues that are flagged up, spotlighted by the Sustainable Development Goals. Incidentally, I think the Sustainable Development Goals are going to be a considerable disappointment. I don't think we will achieve 30% of them by 2030? I really wonder. But nonetheless, that was a brave attempt to address a set of interlinked challenges and opportunities. And what I found was that these younger people were really, really switched on. And then just a final thing that really struck me, probably about 3 or 4 months ago, I came across a collaboration between a British and a German two organizations, and the German one was an electromagnet manufacturer. And the question was, we've got the Chinese squatting like a vast great toad on top of all these sort of supply chains, particularly of rare earth minerals and metals. And I've seen the knock-on effects of that when I've been working in places like Japan. Is there any way that we can cut down a bit the volume of rare earth metals that we're going to need to make our electromagnets? The answer was, AI was asked the question, and it came up with the answer which no one expected, which is you can actually do without rare earth minerals and metals. You can actually produce electromagnets that are 80% cheaper and have 70% smaller climate footprint and so on. So now that may never get through into practice, but we've seen in enzymes and different areas, AI is coming up with these astonishing potential ways forward. Question is, well, it's twofold. Can we get behind that in good time and good order to make sure some of these solutions really get out into the wider world and with the urgency that we need. And at the same time, how do we make sure that Google and Facebook and all of these other companies don't screw up the future on our behalf? Because every time an industry has got the bit between its teeth, whether it was oil and gas or whatever it happens to be, aerospace or the automobile sector, what we find is that we very quickly find ourselves with problems that we never imagined that we would ever face. So how does the sustainability sector engage these companies soon enough to have a real influence on not only how they think, but how they code and how their algorithms and all the rest of it shape both our present and our future.
And I think it's supporting these players on their journey. So I think we find a lot, the kind of first entry point of why a customer might come to us for kind of our climate risk solution is because they are looking to comply, but it's the first step in that direction, and then it's kind of taking them on that journey of as they actually start to get more advanced and have a slightly mature appetite on their sustainability agenda.
Jessica, I love that idea, but the question is who comes to Mitiga in the first place? And I think any supplier of solutions to the wider world has to be very careful to ensure that the people who it's dealing with, in particular companies, they might be manufacturers, they might be insurance companies, whatever it happens to be, that the right people to do exactly what you just described, which is to come up the learning curve and be able to influence their colleagues in a way that takes their colleagues into that evolutionary process. And a lot of the people who get involved in the early stages are, I don't want to be unkind, but they're people who are interested in contracts. They're interested in sort of quality and delivery times and things like that, and price points. They're not strategic thinkers. So we've got to make sure that we're having multiple conversations with our customers and clients at the same time.
I think for us today, we've kind of blended our kind of tech solutions with that human touch. We have I don't know if anyone watching joined our webinar last month, but we had our kind of customer success lead there, and we work hard to kind of have products that are ready to support that compliance quickly, but then we have much more advanced solutions. So those customer success representatives will work very closely with the customer to basically show them what value they can unlock as their journey evolves working with us. That's
I noticed that Natalia Adler, and I don't want to be, I don't know her, but I mean, I don't want to have favorites, but her question was about resilience. And at some stage, I'd love to come back to that because I think it's a crucial issue.
Yeah, and I think we'll definitely spend some time at the end going through questions, but on the topic of resilience, and kind of maybe if we bring that back into our discussion, I think us as humans, we have a habit to focus on the immediate. So we worry about what is the biggest problem to us right now. And I think sadly, that's why resilience sometimes gets overlooked, because often companies see it as immaterial because the drastic climate change isn't happening tomorrow or next year, although some of it is happening, but it's more seen as a long-term threat. I think maybe even looking at boardrooms, because boardrooms are behind a lot of the kind of decision making. How can we make resilience and really prove to people that it is actually an immediate thing that needs action right now?
Yeah, well, it's about 20 years ago, I was out on the lawn in front of the World Economic Forum in Switzerland, and somebody from one of the big four consultancies was in a conversation and kindly included me. And the theme of the conversation was sustainability is dead, resilience is the future. And so I think it's not that the resilience theme hasn't been in play. I think it's fundamental to sustainability. I don't think it remotely replaces it. And I think what we're seeing increasingly is, you're quite right that individual C-suites and boards of major companies are tending to think about resilience as that's for governments or that's for city authorities. That's not so much for us. But we've seen a growing tempo of major supply chains being hammered by, it might be the Panama Canal being shut down because there isn't enough water in it. It might be Houthi rebels in the Suez Canal or whatever. But people are beginning to realize, or it might be, a ship that just blocks the Suez Canal entirely. People are increasingly seeing that the risk of disruption in globalized supply chains is growing. And that's even before you get to China invading Taiwan or blockading the island or whatever. So I think we've got a very precarious future in front of us. Resilience, I think, has got to be not number one, but I mean, it's got to be right in the top grouping of issues that the top teams consider. And they're just a sidestep in a way. I mean, whether it was in Los Angeles with the fires there or in Brazil, I was in Brazil several times last year, and Porto Alegre, we saw swamped, but I mean, and for months, hundreds of thousands of people homeless. One of the things that businesses are going to have to get their brains around, that the only way to deal with these sorts of catastrophic weather problems is to rebuild natural ecosystems. Now, business will immediately say that's no business of ours, that's for governments to do. But new businesses are beginning to spring up whose business it is to rebuild the ecosystems. And if you once, whether it's sponge cities in China, whether it's rebuilding the Mississippi Delta wetland systems, whatever it is, there is a huge benefit to society and to our economies of getting resilience right. The question is, how do we give people this sense that this is a shared responsibility, that there are going to be market opportunities, and make sure that there are market opportunities, so that entrepreneurs and so on come in and start dealing with, helping us deal with some of these issues. I think it's immensely exciting because people talk increasingly about nature and biodiversity. This is an area where the need for investment is literally going through the roof as we speak. So I think it's an immensely exciting time because they're going to see lots of different technologies, lots of different business models of emerging, which we at the moment are hard to imagine. But back to you.
I'm going to ask one question more.
Oh dear.
Pivot to the chat because it's incredibly active and we have a lot of questions coming in from our audience, and I want to make sure we bring some attention to them. On that kind of resilience topic, I think financial incentives is often kind of what dictates action and a lot of decision making, sadly, in the world we live in. How can we shift the view on resilience, so rather than it being perceived as a cost, to actually as a really powerful investment? Do you have any tips there?
I don't have any simple solutions to that, because I think the reality, and it's a painful, is that very often it isn't in the short to medium term something that brings significant financial benefits. And the problem often is also that if you manage to mitigate or moderate a risk or remove it entirely, after it's not happened, people then ask, why did we even invest in that in the first place? Because they haven't been hammered. So we need, it's often said that we need more systemic thinkers in boardrooms and so on. We do, but the science of system thinking has to be evolved quite considerably. And part of that challenge means that we've got to make it digestible and accessible for ordinary decision makers and policy makers and so on. My hope is that AI will actually help quite considerably with that, not just doing the analysis and the processing and all the rest of it, but helping present the data, the information, the intelligence in a way that ordinary people in government and in business and financial markets can begin to get their brains around. And I think that again is why I'm interested and excited by AI. I think we can't do this properly without AI, but AI needs to be worked on and shaped quite actively for it to play that sort of role effectively.
Actively and rapidly as well, I think. Yeah. The rate that things are changing. Now I'm going to bring, the first question I'm going to bring in is from Angelina in the chat. So she says that she's observed that the so-called sustainability hype is over, and companies are struggling to find a new way forward in setting up maybe smaller targets, and are becoming less visionary and becoming pragmatic in their implementation. She's calling it a reality check, which I think is fair enough. How do you think we can better address these arising gaps between vision and implementation?
Well, I mean, thanks for the question. And I would say this, wouldn't I? But sustainability, I don't think, is going away. I mean, we get recessions and booms in fields like this. And we're currently, ESG has been hammered. That's in a recession. Sustainability is coming down the curve as well. But I think in 50 to 100 years, the theme of sustainability will be central to the future's thinking. So, I mean, we should be very careful about thinking just because it's under stress and being critiqued and so on, that's the end of the story. And I know that's not what's behind the question. But I think that what's happening is that the Trump 2.0 administration is some sort of weird aberration. Doesn't mean that it won't have an impact, and it won't have an impact at scale, and probably over the next sort of 7, 8, 9, 10 years. But it's partly the incumbent industries of the past, particularly oil and gas, coal and oil and gas, just seeing the future that's coming at them and not liking it a bit, and therefore putting a lot of money behind the scenes into politicians who will play their game. The automotive sector is playing the same. So in both North America and also in Europe, we see automotive companies now hunkering down around the internal combustion engine and saying, actually, we made these wonderful promises, Mercedes-Benz and so on, that we would be 100% electric vehicles by 2030. We can't do that. Well, no, I understand why they can't do it. And governments have been slow to roll out the charging infrastructures and all the rest of it that we would need. But if it's done right, look at Norway. They're over 80% electric vehicles now. Well, they have oil money and the rest of it, which will have helped considerably. But I think European automakers are setting themselves up to be swept off the board by China, companies like BYD and so on, who are just going hammer and tongs down this route towards electric vehicles and everything that goes with it. And they just announced, as you will have seen, that all of their vehicles, even the cheapest ones, will be fitted with self-driving technology and so on. So I think many incumbent industries are absolutely asleep at the wheel, or they're paralyzed because they see what's coming at them, but they don't know how to respond appropriately. Question in my mind, and this goes back to the question, is the sustainability industry going to be in the same space? And I hope that the answer to that question will be no. This was the moment where we really did get ourselves together and come back recharged and basically disrupt the incumbents in a way that they never expected. So again, I'm sort of going through a period of being quite energized about this. We'll see how it actually plays out.
Love the phrase energized. I think I might need to adopt that into my daily motivation. Given that you've gone into a little bit industries, we actually have a question from Panks J. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but it's a question again regarding industries, asking if you see a particular industry that should lead the change compared to others. So industries like energy and oil and gas are often the usual suspects, but whether there's any others that we should be considering. They then do start to go on about kind of the whole consumption argument that's insatiable and beyond that. But I think we might park that and just focus on the first part of the question.
And the obvious sectors that are going to be right at the forefront of the transition that is coming, whether Trump likes it or not, and whether right-wing politicians like it or not, is going to be focused on critical areas. Energy is one of them. Transportation is another. Agriculture and food is another. You look at some of these big companies like Walmart, where Doug McMillon, their CEO, announced a few years ago that regenerative agriculture was a critical consideration for that company going forward. Yes, people will back off. Yes, people water down their commitments for a while. But underneath all of this, there's a different generation of business leaders coming up to whom this is not now alien, to whom environmentalism is not equivalent to communism. They understand this is the future reality that they're going to have to play their games in, and to win, or at least to survive, they're going to have to do things quite differently. So I think all of those sectors, but crucially, well, two crucially. One is AI, because it goes to everything else. It goes to precision fermentation. It goes to robotics. It goes to you name it. The tomorrow's economy is going to be built around AI, like it or not. But the second sector that we really got to focus a lot more effort on is the financial world, and it's always very easy to look at the people who've done socially responsible investment, impact investment, whatever, ESG, and all the rest of it, and think, we're on the right road. I think a few people in that space very much have been on the right road for a while. Most of them are not, and so again, it's a sector that we've really got to tackle, and we've got a precariously short period of time in which to do that. Just a final point there. I think, a lot of the focus increasingly is on young people. They're going to sort this out. Well, actually, most of the young people I come across are really alarmed about what's coming at them, and actually becoming quite angry about it. So I think we've got to focus on older people as well, and part of what they can do, because there's huge wealth transfer coming now from the baby boomers to younger people. Very inequitable. It's going to go to their children rather than to society as a whole. But as that wealth transition happens, the implications for financial markets are profound. And I think we should be thinking much more than we currently are about how we influence older people to make sure that as they do that wealth cascade, it goes in directions that are supportive of sustainability and of climate solutions and all the rest of it, because that's their. I mean, it's one thing to give younger people money, but if they lose their homes in floods or whatever it is, that's ultimately a betrayal.
It leaves them disillusioned as well.
Yeah.
Well, you're almost taking the words out of my mouth, because we have a few different questions on AI, on financial markets, and on young people. So let's see if we can break those down maybe and help answer some of the audience's question. One from Dermot. So how do we think that the inertia of the dominant corporate infrastructure can be countered to allow the kind of innovation that you're suggesting through your AI examples? So
Yeah.
he's listed some examples: urban mining versus business as usual mining. Is this not a critical and immediate role for government? Big question.
It should be. Thanks for the question, Dermot. I think the answer is that historically, and I've always been interested in history, what's actually driven that sort of innovation has been siege warfare, it's been depressions, it's been plagues, it's been things that give people absolutely no option but to try something different. We're now having to do that, and it's not that we don't have plagues. We had COVID-19. It's not that we don't have crises building up. I mean, like climate and biodiversity emergencies and so on and so forth. But I think, in a way, I don't expect federal and even at times state level governments to crack this one. I think very often the real innovation, you talked about urban mining, will come from city administrations, will come from mayors. I mean, you're seeing city-based leaders taking a much more active, involved role in some of this, because they can see the implications for their countries. I had an email earlier on today from someone in Holland who was just basically saying, we have got to crack this climate crisis. Holland is, well, I should say the Netherlands, is the second country in the world in terms of its vulnerability to sea level rises. Amsterdam, I think, is about 2 meters underwater, technically. A lot of the country is much worse. So I think we've got to, in some ways, we've focused on business and we focus on the financial markets. And we've thought that that's where the solutions are going to come from. And that's true. But if we're going to give the market and other incentives to make sure that those solutions come through at the necessary speed and scale, then governments have to play their role. And I think we've got to play the same game that we did with the private sector, with the public sector. And that means picking out best practice, celebrating the champions, supporting them where we can, spreading best practice, and so on. There's some people doing that work already, but there should be a lot more of that going on.
Thank you for that, John. Now our financial market question comes from Jamie, and it takes us back to Omnibus and the fun world of reporting and regulations.
Right.
So Jamie said that their priority with the Omnibus package and all the deregulation that they'll see in the short term, and they feel they should really sell the business case in capital markets so that they incline towards the strategic path instead of purely compliance. How can they ensure it and not simultaneously create an imaginary bubble?
Well, I think bubbles will happen. I think we're in a most magnificent example of the moment with, AI is part of all of that. And I think within the next 12 months, we'll have a significant deflation of that bubble. There will be many other bubbles. And I think the sustainability transition, as it cranks through, given the nature of human nature and of markets, we'll see many other bubbles as well. Now, it would be lovely if we didn't have that frothiness and the collapse of bubbles and all the collateral damage that comes from that. But that in a way, unfortunately, is the way the human species progresses. What goes up can come down. And one of the things I've done since 1994 is to try and plot the underlying trajectories in all of this, and the ups and the downs, the booms and the recessions, and so on. And I think one of the things that we see is that underlying it all, there is a paradigm shift in the sense that 50 to 60 years from now, people will look back and think, why did we not see that coming? There was a profound economic transformation underway. It was not happening everywhere, so people didn't see it in the way and play into it in the way that they should have done. But in between times, there are these horrible, challenging moments where suddenly problematic leaders, politicians, and others come up, and they take us in a very surprising and not entirely helpful direction. So I'm genuinely very optimistic about the medium to long term, but unfortunately, I think we need to go through some absolute crises in order to get that. I'm not using that argument as environmentalists used to do. Given one more good crisis, and suddenly the world will wake up. Well, we've had LA, we've had all these different things.
Had our fair share, I think.
I think we've had our fair share, and there's something standing in the way of us understanding what the wider world is trying to tell us, and then reacting in the appropriate way. So to the question, I think it's a generational shift apart from anything else that is needed. I think we need younger people who can see what's going on, whose future this will affect, and therefore who will play into it through innovation, through entrepreneurship, through investment, and so on. And also, hopefully, by being better politicians, the ones that we're cursed, I was about to say blessed with, but cursed with at the moment.
Don't worry, I might have put you straight there. But I think you're right. Every kind of new generation that we see come through are closer to these long-term risks being more immediate. And I think that drives a lot of the push for them to take action. We've got a couple of questions from a watcher called Alison. I'm going to merge two of them together. And they, I think, talk in a little bit to that kind of younger population.
Yeah, great.
From my understanding, more on the consumer side, but I'll put the questions to you and you let's see how you interpret them. She says that investor pressure will be key, and she, as a middle-aged woman, is more able to put her money where her mouth is. And her concern is, how can we enable young people who care about it to be able to do the same? And another question that she's also posted is about the impact outcome of positive behaviour change, and how important that is in all ways, and kind of the constraints of compliance not necessarily driving that positive behaviour change. But I think there's a little bit of a overlap between those two questions, so I'm sharing them over.
I think there may well be, and I'll probably do a horrible violence to both sides of the questioning. But let me try. I mean, I think citizen action is fundamentally important. I think we start to see, for example, groups of citizens coming out into the streets in the United States. In 1970, the first ever Earth Day brought 20 million Americans out onto the streets. That had a massive impact on regulation, like the National Environmental Policy Act and so on, which was adopted, that sort of approach adopted around the world. So citizen action is fundamental. In the late 80s, with a colleague, Julia Hales, I wrote a book called The Green Consumer Guide. It sold 1 million copies in 18 months and had a massive impact on companies. What happened was ordinary citizens started to realize they could use their consumer purchases and so on to put pressure on brands and the companies behind them. Now, what we see is that there's a cycle there too, that for about 3 or 4 years, people can become spooked about a particular set of issues, but then they prefer to go back to sleep. They want somebody else to solve these sorts of things. So if you're going to use consumer pressure to really advance a systemic change agenda, you actually need to make sure that they understand what the dynamics of what they're trying to do, and you then feed back to them the progress that they're helping to make at the sort of social or economic level. The problem with the green consumer movement was that, in a way, many of the key actors, the retail groups and so on, had very limited interest in feeding back to consumers. Well done for putting pressure on getting lead out or phosphate out or mercury out or whatever or chlorine out of these particular products. So somehow that sort of intelligence system that feeds out into wider society has to be much better than it currently is. And one of the things that really worries me at the moment, and somehow we're going to have to deal with, is the pressure that the print media and other media are increasingly under to squeeze down the time frames of their coverage of some of these topics. I mean, it's not just sound bites. I mean, every day we hear people wanting, more and more distilled information. Well, good luck with that, because trying to get the complexity of system change and climate emergencies and these sorts of things into a soundbite is really problematic unless people already understand the underlying science, and people do not yet understand the underlying science. So citizen action, crucial. Consumer activity, when you can get it going, really, really important. And this financial role of citizens in terms of thinking about where they put what money they have, where they invest it, and so on, really, really important. Now, a final point there is just simply that be warned. I have a pension because I've been employed, if that's what I can call it, for quite long parts of my life. I've got my own pension. I've invested it in a bunch of things that seem to me to make sense in a sustainability frame. The performance against, if I'd put it in tobacco or into coal or in these sorts of things, has been really quite distressing at times. But we've got to be able to take some of that pain, but I think we have to give public health warning to people that for a period of time, still, these sorts of investments are at greater risk of underperforming. The time will come where suddenly they'll outperform everything, but trying to guess when that'll happen, good luck with it. And if you've got a good sense of it, let me know.
I mean, I'm an optimist in that space, and I strongly believe that the long-term returns for investing in more sustainable.
It's fine if you're young, but if you're, I'm 75. I feel in some strange way I'm only just getting started. I think the next 10 to 15 years are going to see much more change than the last 50. But older people tend to have it's obvious, but a more constrained time frame in mind. And again, I think that's one of the reasons why younger people, as citizens, as consumers, as investors, will be so important.
Now, I know, John, we've slightly breached our 45 minutes. We still have quite a few questions. I'm not saying we should work through all of them, but how do you feel about using 5 more minutes to answer a couple more?
I'm happy. Yeah.
Perfect.
Thanks everyone for the quick questions. But
we may not be able to cover them all, but I'm going to reinforce what I said at the beginning. We will follow up with answers to any questions we have to cover offline afterwards. And you're also very welcome to reach out to myself or John via LinkedIn at any point if you want some more colour to the discussion. a question from Natalia, and it pivots on a slightly different sector that we haven't touched on yet. Do you view an evolving role of the insurance sector in promoting sustainability and resilience? Shouldn't we be expecting more from these in these areas?
Yes, I mean, thanks, Natalia. I mean, I've spent 30 plus years trying to engage the insurance industry and the reinsurance industry behind it. And I've seen at times utter stupidity in the sector, as, for example, when a very long time ago, insurers underwrote risks in the United States in areas like asbestos, contaminated land, radioactive waste, and so on. And it didn't matter if you told them what the problem was going to be. They chose to ignore it. And 20% of the losses that almost brought the Lloyd's insurance market down were linked to those sorts of risks having been misunderstood. And here we go again. I mean, you have these cycles where the insurers and reinsurers get animated about climate and other parts of our agenda, and then they do research and they sponsor activities, and they're always interested, those insurance companies, because they're big investors too. They take their premium income and they invest in stock markets. So if you can get them to think in the right way, and it cascades to their investment activities, that can be very powerful as a lever of change. But the corporate memory in that sector is precariously short, in the sense that people aren't there for a lifetime any longer. So you get this churn. People forget what lessons were learned by previous generations of their colleagues. So the question again is, can AI help us with building a better set of corporate memories that embed in the right way some of the experience that has been learned at earlier stages? So I think they're fundamentally important. I think we have to engage them, but we should be very careful not to be seduced into thinking that once they know what the right answer is, they'll do it.
What I can say from our side, and I don't know, John, if this will be music to your ears or utterly terrifying, but we are seeing a lot more demand, both directly from insurance providers, but also from purchasers of insurance, to engage with us to incorporate climate risk into helping them actually lower some of their premiums and actually help secure better insurance deals. So for us, it's a growing area, I would say.
No, and that's great. That's one of the reasons I'm very interested in Mitiga and what you're trying to do. So I'm not saying that the insurance and reinsurance industries don't have an incredibly important role to play here, but I just think that they don't get there in one step. They need coaxing in order to bring them into doing the right thing in the right way.
Now I'm going to try and squeeze in one, maybe two more questions. From Lily, with global temperatures on track to overshoot 1.5 degrees, how should companies adjust their transition strategies to remain resilient and relevant? And should corporate sustainability plans now think about adaptation alongside mitigation? And what does that mean in practice?
Well, I think they should always have done that, because anyone who understands human behavior and political process and so on will have long since realized that we will not get our act together in time to ward off some of the collateral damage that climate and other related factors are going to bring. So I think we have to think about mitigation. We have to think about adaptive strategies. I think the argument of activists was always, and I sympathize with, if you once get into that adaptation area, you don't start to think about how do you prevent climate change, how do you properly address the systemic problem at its root. But no, I think we've got to do everything simultaneously now, and that sounds impossible, and it sounds demanding. It's not. I mean, it's certainly going to be challenging, but it's absolutely not impossible. We've got to make it happen. And I think one of the things reason I like going and seeing people who are doing extraordinary things is that somebody once said, now, if you see something that's already happening and they're showing that it's possible, it suggests that probably it's not impossible as most people consider it to be. So a lot of the stuff that we want to see happening is already happening in different parts of the world. Go out and meet the people and learn from them, and bring your top teams with you if you possibly can, because that experiential learning is so powerful.
Thank you, John. Now, I'm going to end with a question from Ludovic, which I'm going to merge with a question of my own, because I think it's really nice to end this conversation with kind of one key takeaway. So the question is, what would be your number one kind of piece of advice to help sustainability managers understand better the link between sustainability, resilience, and the business stakes?
I wish I could just come up with a sort of very simple one-liner on that. But I think my sense is that this is going to take decades to resolve. I don't think there's any one thing that any of us can do that will instantaneously solve the challenges that we face, or get our enterprise or organization or whatever in the position that it can sort of scoop up the opportunities of the future. But I think the one thing that I would say to any of us is, don't be overwhelmed. I mean, it's easy to say, but don't be overwhelmed about what's coming at us, because it's only just begun. It's going to get a lot worse before it has any chance of getting any better. There's going to be conflict in the next sort of 3 to 4 years on a scale that we haven't seen for quite some time. And we're going to have to get through that. And I think we will, to a considerable degree, find this existentially challenging. But I once asked my parents, who were both in the Second World War, when their happiest moment was, and they both said the same thing. My father was a fighter pilot in the Battle of Britain. My mother was an army truck driver. They said it was in the Second World War, because suddenly you had this feeling that everyone was working together with a common purpose. Well, the sustainability agenda has very many of those dynamics. I think we're moving into a period of challenge, which is extraordinary. Certainly, current generations haven't seen anything quite like it before. But if we do it in the right way and we do it together, it could be the sort of thing that we'd be gaily telling our children and grandchildren about decades from now. Anyway, that's what I choose to believe. And I think if enough of us choose to believe, we can actually make this work.
Thank you. Hopefully, between our optimism and our feeling of being energized, we will really drive this forward. But thank you so much, John, for your time. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you this afternoon. And for those that are still tuned in, we'll be following up with the recording in case you want to watch back any key moments, or if you want to share it on with your peers. And in that follow-up, we'll also share contact details should you want to reach out to Mitiga, myself, or John with any further questions.
Thank you, Jessica, and thanks everyone on the call.